In 2021, I read 100 books in a year, and there were a lot of benefits, but there were also almost just as many disadvantages. So I want to talk through those today and just discuss whether it's really worth reading 100 books in a year. I'm sure a lot of people watching will be wanting to try it out themselves. So I thought I would make a video just talking about it. It's been a long time since I actually did the 100 books challenge, but I think in a way that's better because it means that I've actually been able to reflect on the whole thing and not just have finished the challenge and then decided to talk about it. I mainly started it because I wanted something to do during COVID and I was sick, so I wasn't really seeing anyone, and I thought that would be a good opportunity to catch up on my really long to be read list. It's quite an impressive thing to do, so it's also assumed to be automatically beneficial and useful, and I don't necessarily think that that's the case. So of course, one of the main advantages is you get to read all the books that you want to read. However, if you're someone that has never really done any structured reading before, I've never done that before, then I wouldn't really recommend this for you because I've never had to sort of quantify my reading, if that makes sense. So reading has always been something to do whenever I feel like it, and on holidays, on trains, or just it's been a very relaxed and free thing for me to do, which it should be. But if you want to do this 100 books challenge, you really have to sort of structure it accordingly. So you have to be like, I'm going to read this many books this month, and then the next month plan it out again. But I only had a few books that I wanted to read, and I read them all very quickly and realised I don't know what else I want to read. So towards the end of the year, there was sort of a panicked scramble to find more books that I could read and would want to read, and that was really stressful because I wanted to actually complete the goal and be able to say I read 100 books in a year. But that also put a lot of pressure on me because as the year was going on, I was realising just how many books I'm going to have to read if I want to catch up, because the first month, the next year looks so far away and you don't really have to think about that at all. But by October, November, December, you realise that you have to read so many books in just that time. There was definitely a kind of bias towards picking shorter books as the year went on, and it wasn't really about actually enjoying the books, it was more about completing the challenge. So it was really exciting to be able to read so many books in such a short amount of time. It was very intense and I really liked that challenge aspect of it, but I also think that it wasn't about the books anymore, it was more about just wanting to complete the goal and feeling really accomplished when you get to the end, which happened for a little bit, which is great, but not anymore. Looking back on it 2 years later, I can hardly recall most of the books that I read. There are a few that stick out, but one of the main problems was because I was reading them so close together, they would all merge into one. So even if I was able to say I read this book, I wouldn't be able to properly talk about it and have an interesting discussion about it because I can't remember much about it. I mean, of course it's been 2 years, but a lot of details that I think were a part of that book were actually a part of a book that I read way before that. Another thing that's kind of linked to that is that my head would be so completely full of characters and words and plot lines and storylines because it was all so close together. As soon as I finished one book, I would have to start the next one. And normally when I read just in my daily life, I'll read a little bit of one story, and then the next day read a bit more, and the next day read a bit more, and then when I finish it, I take a little break just so I can sort of like think about it and like write about it and talk about it with other people. You know, I might even have like weeks long gaps in between the books that I read. I couldn't really digest any of the information that I was taking in, which meant that all the time in the back of my head there would just be a kind of replay and a rerun and a strange like mixture of all the books I had read recently, and I wasn't really able to do much else besides read. So when I was reading the book in 2021, I didn't have school, so it was COVID, we were in lockdown, but I was also really ill, so I couldn't walk and I couldn't go to school. That's a whole separate issue. So I spent all of my time reading and then completing all of my online work in a separate time, but I don't think that you would be able to do it in the way that I did it by also having to balance a job or college or school. Something I found really interesting about reading them in such short succession was the fact that I could, in the first few pages of starting a book or in the first chapter, I could almost predict what was going to happen next very quickly, or I could sort of categorize the author into a style of writing, and then it would make it easier for me to read the book faster because I was already expecting something that was very likely to happen, which I kind of enjoy. I kind of don't enjoy because it's nice to not have any expectations about a piece of writing and then have it surprise you. So after having completed the 100 books, I was so exhausted that I did not touch a book for like at least a few months. And after that, I wasn't really interested in fiction books anymore because I was so bored of them. And I started venturing into non-fiction books, which I've never done before. I've spent my whole life reading fiction books, and it was really only a few years ago that I started to explore non-fiction books because I found a really interesting one in the attic of a family friend's house, and I realised how convenient it was to read non-fiction books and have it tie into my A-level courses, and it made it so much easier and interesting because you're actually linking things that you learn into what the book's talking about. But after that, I think the majority of books that I've read in the past 2 years have been very non-fiction based, and also they've been very, very slow. I have spent weeks and weeks and weeks reading just one book, and before I was always finishing a fiction book within like a couple of days, and I don't know if that's because I'm reading different genres, if I'm reading non-fiction and fiction, and maybe non-fiction takes longer to read because there's more facts that you need to digest, and fiction is written in a way so that it's easier for you to get involved in the script because it's constantly trying to hook you in. In terms of things I could improve, because sort of slated the 100 books challenge, I would definitely not increase the amount of books that you're currently reading drastically. So if you were only reading a few books a year, then I would not go immediately for the 100 books challenge. I would definitely pick smaller periods of time where you can actually realistically picture what you're going to be doing at that point in the future. So maybe even like the week, maybe you read a book a week, that would give you 52 in a year, or you could read one or a set number a month, and just sort of get yourself used to introducing reading back into your life, because I actually hadn't read for a long time. I'd sort of forgotten about it. By a long time I mean like 1 year, because I'm 17. So going from not reading for like a year and a half at all to reading 100 books in a year was really, really intense, and I really liked it. It was really fun, but it was definitely more about the challenge than reading books. So if you're interested in a challenge and testing your reading skills, then I would recommend doing this, but definitely not if you want to read all of the books that you've been thinking about reading. If you want to do that, I would spread them out and work through a few at a time instead of set a really, really big goal. It can be fun to have a really big goal. And I get why people do it, but it's not something I would recommend people doing. Maybe if you were to annotate the book as you were going through it and write about it in a separate journal, maybe, if you don't like writing on the books. I borrow all of my books, so I don't actually have any books. I have about 3, so I would never write on my books. But if you were to digest what you were reading at the same time, which is something that you would do if you were like reading a book to study, then that might make it easier for you to complete this huge goal and be able to retain the information. That would probably help, and that's something I've started doing after the 100 books challenge, because I wanted to be able to remember the books that I was reading and actually enjoy what I was reading and sort of apply any morals of the story or information that they provided. I would want to put that into my life and sort of like slowly feed it into my life and change the way that I think, even with just one book, because there's so much information in just one book, and I don't think that should be overlooked. It felt very wasteful to have read 100 books that I wanted to read, and I didn't actually appreciate just how much information and how much work and effort has gone into it. So I think that's everything I want to say about this. If you want to read 100 books in a year, definitely go for it. Definitely make a list of all the books that you want to read, of 100 books that you want to read, and not just 6 or 20, because you will get through them so much quicker than you think you will. And try your best to really identify each book that you read and make sure that you will remember it by actually reading it and not just skimming it and thinking about how you're progressing towards this goal of getting to 100 books. And try and enjoy it. Try not to put too much pressure on yourself to get to 100. It's okay if you don't get to 100. It's still really impressive if you read less than that. And if you just make reading something that you can do all of the time, because it's a really useful hobby for anything that you do.